The conflict between the Arab nations and Israel did not begin in 1948. It is not about oil, borders, or modern politics. The Bible reveals its true origin is a 4,000-year-old family tragedy, a story of two sons, two mothers, and two conflicting promises that were born in the tent of Abraham. To understand the modern war, you must first understand the ancient wound. Our story begins with a man named Abram, later called Abraham, and a divine promise. God called Abram out of his homeland and promised to make him into a great nation, a blessing to the entire earth, with descendants as numerous as the stars. But there was a problem. His wife, Sarai, later called Sarah, was barren. Years turned into decades, and the promised child never came. Faced with the silence of heaven and the reality of their old age, their faith faltered. It was then that Sarai devised a human plan to fulfill a divine promise. Following the custom of the time, she urged Abram to take her Egyptian handmaiden Hagar as a wife so that she might bear a child on Sarai's behalf. It was a decision born of doubt and impatience, an attempt to build God's kingdom with man's hands. Abram agreed. Hagar conceived, and the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The book of Genesis tells us that as soon as Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarai. In return, Sarai dealt harshly with her, and the peace of Abraham's house was shattered by jealousy and bitterness. The first seeds of conflict were sown, not between nations but between two women under the same roof, competing for the honor of bearing the promised son. The strife in Abraham's household became so severe that Hagar fled into the harsh wilderness. It was there, alone and desperate, that she had a divine encounter. The angel of the Lord found her and gave her a difficult command: return and submit. But with it came a world-altering promise. He told her to name her son Ishmael, which in Hebrew is Yishmael. It is a combination of Shama, meaning to hear, and El, one of the names for God. The name literally means God hears. It was a permanent testament that even in her deepest affliction and rejection, the God of the universe saw her, heard her cry, and intervened. Then the angel gave the prophecy that would define Ishmael's descendants for all of history. He said, "He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him." In the ancient Eastern mindset, this was not purely an insult. The wild ass was a symbol of absolute freedom, an untamable creature that roamed the desert at will, refusing any harness or yoke. This was a prophecy that Ishmael's descendants would be a fiercely independent, proud, and nomadic people who would resist being ruled by any other nation. But this untamable freedom came with a price. The prophecy immediately continues, "His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him." This foretold that their fierce independence would lead to a destiny of perpetual conflict with their surrounding neighbors. Finally, the angel says, "And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren," signifying that this conflict would not be from a distance, but up close, living alongside the very family members from which he was separated. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son. But God had not forgotten his original promise. When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him again. It was here he changed their names, from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. Then God made a promise that seemed so impossible, it provoked laughter. He declared that Sarah herself, at 90 years old, would bear a son. The Bible tells us Abraham fell face down and laughed, thinking, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old?" Later, Sarah, listening from the tent, also laughed to herself. Their laughter was not of joy, but of human doubt, forged by decades of waiting. God ordained that their son's name, Isaac, would mean he laughs, a permanent reminder of their disbelief and his faithfulness. In his love for his firstborn, Abraham pleaded with God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." God's response is one of the most critical moments in history, because he makes a clear distinction between a blessing and a covenant. First, God grants a great blessing to Ishmael. He says, "I will surely bless him, I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." This is a promise of earthly greatness, of population and political power, the very promise that gives rise to the great Arab peoples. But then God separates his covenant. He says, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac." This covenant was different. It was not just a blessing of greatness, it was a spiritual contract. It included the promise of a specific land, the promise of a specific spiritual lineage through which the Messiah would come, and the promise of a unique relationship with God himself. The blessing was for both sons, but the covenant, the redemptive plan for all of humanity, was for Isaac alone. It was a sovereign choice that set the two brothers and their descendants on two different, preordained paths. Just as God promised, Sarah conceived and bore a son in her old age, and Abraham named him Isaac. When the child was weaned, Abraham held a great feast, a massive celebration for the long-awaited heir of the covenant. But it was at this feast that the simmering conflict finally came to a head. The book of Genesis tells us that Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac. The Hebrew word used here is metzachek, which comes from the very same root as Isaac's name, Yitzhak. Ishmael wasn't just teasing, he was Isaac-ing Isaac. It was a deep and scornful mockery of Isaac's status as the true heir, a challenge to his legitimacy as the son of laughter. Sarah saw this not as childish play, but as a direct assault on the covenant promise. Her reaction was swift and absolute. She went to Abraham and demanded, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." This request plunged Abraham into immense personal anguish. For 13 years, Ishmael had been the son he raised and loved. Being commanded to send his firstborn into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness was a heart-wrenching test, a moment that pitted his fatherly love against his obedience to God's command. It was then that God himself intervened. He told Abraham not to be distressed, but to listen to Sarah, because as God stated, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In an act of profound faith, a stark contrast to his earlier doubt, Abraham chose to obey God's difficult word. But even in this painful separation, God showed his compassion, reassuring the grieving father. "I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Abraham, in his faithfulness, obeyed. Early the next morning, he took bread and a skin of water, gave it to Hagar, and sent her and their son Ishmael away. They departed and wandered into the harsh wilderness of Beersheba. Soon the water was gone. In complete despair, believing her son would die, Hagar placed him under a bush and went to sit about a bowshot away, weeping, "I cannot watch the boy die." It was in this moment of absolute hopelessness that God intervened once again. The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." The very name Ishmael was fulfilled once more. God hears. He then opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, saving them from death. But God did not just save them. He reaffirmed their destiny. He told Hagar, "Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." The Bible then tells us God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. a vast arid region in the Sinai Peninsula strategically located on the ancient trade routes between Egypt, Canaan, and Arabia. He became an archer, a master of the desert, and God's promise to make him the father of 12 rulers was fulfilled literally. Genesis chapter 25 lists the 12 sons of Ishmael who became tribal chieftains. Names like Nebaioth, whose descendants are believed to have become the powerful Nabateans who built the city of Petra. Kedar, a name synonymous with powerful Arab tribes mentioned throughout the Old Testament, and others like Adbeel and Mibsam. These 12 princes and their tribes spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula, becoming the progenitors of the great Arab peoples, and so the two lines of Abraham were set on their separate, prophesied paths. Through Isaac came the covenant, the promise of the land of Canaan and the lineage of the Messiah. Through Ishmael came the blessing of a great nation, the 12 princes who would become the forefathers of the Arab peoples, destined to live in the wilderness and in the presence of their brethren. This is the biblical origin of the modern conflict. At its core, the strife that has defined the Middle East for millennia is not about modern politics, oil, or even the events of 1948. It is the continuation of a 4,000-year-old family dispute over birthright, inheritance, and God's covenant. It is the world's oldest sibling rivalry playing out with tanks and missiles on a geopolitical stage. The prophecy that Ishmael's hand would be against every man and every man's hand against him has been fulfilled with tragic consistency throughout history. The constant wars, the deep-seated animosity, the struggle over the Holy Land, it is all an echo of that moment in Abraham's tent. The names of the nations have changed, the empires have risen and fallen, the weapons have become more deadly, but the ancient wound between the two sons of Abraham has never truly healed. To understand the headlines coming from the Middle East, you must first understand the heartbreak in Abraham's family. The conflict is not irrational. It is the playing out of an ancient spiritual and fraternal reality, one that was recorded in the book of Genesis thousands of years before the modern nations of Israel and its neighbors ever existed. So when you see the rockets glare over the deserts of the Middle East, you are not just seeing a modern conflict, you are seeing the tears of Hagar, the pain of Abraham, and the ancient rivalry of two brothers still echoing 4,000 years later. The wound was ancient, and the war is its legacy. This briefing is now complete, but the investigation never ends. To ensure you receive all future declassifications, be sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Like this video to signal its importance, and share it with others who are ready to look beyond the headlines. Leave your own intel in the comments below. There is much more to declassify.